For most people, a refinery problem sounds distant. It sounds like something that happens behind gates, inside industrial equipment, far from everyday life. But for ordinary families, it can become personal very quickly. Because when something goes wrong inside the fuel system, the effects do not stay inside the plant. They move outward. They show up at the pump, in weekly spending, and in the quiet financial pressure that builds inside a household budget. That is the real story here. Not the machinery by itself, and not the company at the center of the incident. The real story is how a problem at one part of the fuel system can end up costing everyday people more money. It matters because most households do not experience the energy market through technical reports or trading screens. They experience it through the price they see when they pull into a gas station. And right now, that price is already high enough to hurt. The national average for regular gasoline is around $4.53 a gallon. According to AAA, mid-grade is above $5. Premium is higher still. Diesel is well above that. 1 year ago, regular gasoline was much lower. So this is already a market where many drivers are paying significantly more than they were before. That means there is very little cushion left for households that depend on predictable weekly costs. This is why a refinery problem matters so much more than it may sound at first. If the system were relaxed, if supply were comfortable, if prices were already low, one disruption might feel like background noise. But that is not the setting here. People are already paying high prices. Household budgets are already being stretched. And in that kind of environment, even a single refinery problem can matter more than it otherwise would. The reason is simple. Gasoline is one of the few prices people see constantly. Most households do not monitor wholesale costs. They do not check refinery utilization or production data every week. But they do see the sign at the gas station. They see it on the way to work. They see it while driving home. They see it while thinking about groceries, rent, utilities, and everything else that has to fit inside the same monthly budget. That constant visibility gives fuel prices unusual power. A rise at the pump is immediate. It does not wait for a monthly bill. It does not arrive quietly. It is public, repeated, and unavoidable. For many working families, gasoline is not optional. It is tied to work, school, errands, appointments, and the basic routines that keep life functioning. So when fuel gets more expensive, the household does not have much time to adapt. The pressure arrives first, the adjustment comes later. That is why this topic deserves explanation. People often hear about refinery outages, explosions, maintenance, or shutdowns. But those stories can sound technical and far removed from daily life. The language is industrial, the locations may be hundreds of miles away, and yet the effects can still move quickly into consumer prices. So the important question is not just what happened at a refinery. The important question is what that kind of problem does to a fuel market that is already tight, and why that can end up affecting the cost of an ordinary week for ordinary people. The basic mechanics are not mysterious, but they are often overlooked. Gasoline prices are not driven by crude oil alone. The U.S. Energy Information Administration explains that retail gasoline prices reflect several major components: crude oil, taxes, refining costs and profits, and distribution and marketing. That means the refining stage matters. It is one of the places where pressure inside the system can turn into higher costs outside the system. The EIA also states clearly that gasoline prices can change quickly when there are disruptions in crude oil supplies, refinery operations, or gasoline pipeline deliveries. In other words, refinery operations are not a side detail. They are one of the core points where problems can translate into price pressure. And when available gasoline supply falls relative to demand, prices tend to rise. That is the key idea to hold on to from the start of this video. A refinery problem matters because refineries are part of the process that turns crude oil into usable fuel for drivers. If that process is disrupted, even briefly, the market can become more sensitive. And if the market is already sensitive, households can end up feeling the effects faster than they might expect. This becomes easier to understand when looking at the broader market backdrop. In the latest weekly petroleum data from the EIA for the week ending May 1st, U.S. crude oil refinery inputs averaged about 16 million barrels per day. Refinery utilization was about 90.1% of operable capacity. Gasoline production decreased to roughly 9.6 million barrels per day. Distillate production also declined. Those numbers matter because they show this is not a story unfolding in a perfectly loose system. Gasoline production had already moved lower in the most recent weekly data. That does not mean every refinery problem automatically creates a national price spike. It does mean the market can become more vulnerable when production is softer and inventories are already under pressure. In that kind of setting, a disruption does not arrive in isolation. It lands in a system that may already have less room to absorb new stress. There are signs of that pressure elsewhere too. Reuters reported that gasoline futures climbed to about $3.74 a gallon on April 29th, the highest level since 2022. Reuters also cited Morgan Stanley saying U.S. gasoline inventories could fall to around 198 million barrels by the end of summer, which would be an unusually low level for that time of year. Taken together, those signals point to a market that is not especially comfortable. and that is the part that matters for households. Consumers do not need to follow futures prices or inventory estimates to be affected by them. What they need to know is whether the market has enough supply, enough flexibility, and enough spare room to keep pump prices from rising further. When those buffers look weaker, refinery problems matter more. That brings us to the case at the center of this story. On May 8, Reuters reported that a heater on a reformer unit at PBF Energy's Chalmette refinery in Louisiana exploded and caught fire. The refinery has a capacity of 190,000 barrels per day. The reformer unit involved was rated at about 17,500 barrels per day. The fire began around 12:51 p.m. local time and was brought under control by about 2:30 p.m. Reuters reported that there were no injuries and no off-site impacts according to on-site monitoring. At first glance, this may still sound like a technical plant incident, but the specific unit involved is what makes the story economically important. Reuters noted that reformers are important because they help convert refinery products into high-octane components used in premium and mid-grade gasoline. That is where this stops being just a refinery story and becomes a fuel market story. The issue is not simply that there was a fire. The issue is that the problem occurred in a part of the refining process connected to gasoline blending and fuel quality components that matter. In the retail market, there is an important limit here, and it matters to keep the reporting precise. Reuters and AP both indicated that the full impact on production was not yet clear. The cause was still under investigation. So it would be wrong to overstate what happened or claim a fully measured output loss that has not been confirmed. But it is entirely fair, based on the reporting, to say that this was a serious problem at a refinery unit tied to producing high-octane gasoline components in a market that was already under pressure. And that is enough to explain why families should care. Because when the fuel market is already tight, people do not need a massive nationwide shutdown to feel the effects of new strain. They only need a system that is already sensitive, already expensive, and already forcing households to pay more than they paid a year ago. In that kind of market, refinery problems do not remain industrial details for long. They become part of the reason fuel stays costly, and part of the reason household budgets stay tight. So the question is no longer whether a refinery problem sounds dramatic. The real question is how a disruption inside one fuel plant can travel through the system and eventually land in the wallet of someone just trying to get through an ordinary week. That is where the next part begins. Because once the refinery problem enters a market that is already tight, the next step is understanding the chain reaction, how an industrial disruption becomes price pressure, and how price pressure becomes everyday financial strain. To understand how a refinery problem reaches ordinary households, it helps to follow the pressure step by step. The first point is simple. Gasoline prices are not determined by crude oil alone. The U.S. Energy Information Administration breaks the retail price of gasoline into several major parts: the cost of crude oil, taxes, refining costs and profits, and distribution and marketing. That means refining is not just a technical stage hidden somewhere in the middle of the system. It is one of the places where stress inside the fuel market can become higher costs outside the fuel market. The EIA also states that gasoline prices can change quickly when there are disruptions in crude oil supplies, refinery operations, or gasoline pipeline deliveries. So when a refinery problem happens, the market does not treat it as an isolated industrial event. It treats it as a potential supply problem, or at least as a sign that supply may become tighter than it already is. That is where the cause and effect chain begins. A refinery problem can reduce output directly, or it can weaken part of the refining process that the market depends on. If that happens when gasoline production is already softer, or when inventories are already expected to stay tight, traders, wholesalers, and retailers become more sensitive to the risk of reduced supply. That sensitivity matters because fuel prices do not need a complete nationwide shortage to move higher. They can respond to a market that suddenly feels less comfortable. That broader backdrop was already in place. In the weekly petroleum data for the week ending May 1st, the EIA reported that U.S. crude oil refinery inputs averaged about 16 million barrels per day, down by 42,000 barrels per day from the previous week. Refinery utilization stood at about 90.1% of operable capacity. Gasoline production decreased to roughly 9.6 million barrels per day, while distillate production also declined. That is important because it shows the market was already dealing with lower gasoline production before this specific refinery problem became part of the story. There were other signs of stress as well. Reuters reported on April 29 that gasoline futures had climbed about 5% to $3.74 to $3 per gallon, the highest level since 2022. Then on May 6, Reuters cited Morgan Stanley saying U.S. gasoline inventories could fall to around 198 million barrels by the end of summer, lower than the 2022 low of 215.6 million barrels for that time of year. Those figures do not prove that one refinery incident will determine the entire market. But they do show that this was not a calm system with excess room to absorb new problems. That context is what makes the Chalmette incident more important than it may sound at first. On May 8, Reuters reported that a heater on a reformer unit at PBF Energy's Chalmette refinery in Louisiana exploded and caught fire. The refinery itself has a capacity of 190,000 barrels per day. The reformer unit involved was rated at about 17,500 barrels per day. The fire began around 12:51 p.m. local time and was brought under control by around 2:30 p.m. There were no reported injuries, and Reuters said on-site monitoring found no off-site impacts. But the most important detail was not simply that there was a fire. It was where the fire occurred. Reuters noted that reformers are used to help convert refinery products into high-octane components for premium and mid-grade gasoline. That turns the incident from a generic refinery accident into something more specific. The market was not just looking at damage inside a plant, it was looking at a problem involving a unit connected to fuel blending components that matter in the gasoline market. That does not mean the public record already proves a precise nationwide price effect. It does not. Reuters and AP both indicated that the full production impact was still unclear, and the cause remained under investigation. So it would be wrong to claim an exact number of lost gallons, or to say with certainty how many cents this one incident added to prices. The verified reporting does not support that. What the verified reporting does support is a more careful conclusion. A refinery problem at a reformer matters because it affects a part of the process tied to high-octane gasoline components, and it happened at a time when the market was already showing signs of tighter conditions. That combination is enough to explain why traders, suppliers, and consumers pay attention. This is the point where a refinery problem becomes a wallet problem, not because every incident causes instant nationwide panic, but because fuel markets are built on chains of supply, production, and distribution that have to keep moving smoothly. When one part of that chain becomes less reliable, the cost of the system can become more sensitive. And when the system is already expensive, that sensitivity is more likely to be felt by consumers. Think about the sequence in practical terms. A problem hits a refinery unit, the market sees a risk to part of the gasoline-making process. Existing signs of tightness, like lower gasoline production or thinner inventories, make that risk feel larger. Gasoline futures are already elevated. Retail prices are already high, so the new disruption lands in a market where there is less room for comfort than usual. That is what matters to the person watching at home, not the exact engineering details, and not the company's internal maintenance issues. What matters is that each new refinery problem can land in a fuel market that is already charging families more than they were paying a year ago. AAS national averages show that clearly regular gasoline is around $4.530 per gallon. Mid-grade is $5.0 to $2. Premium is $5.394. Diesel is $5.650. A year ago, regular was about $3.146 per gallon. That gap is large enough to matter before any new refinery problem enters the picture. So when an incident like Chalmette happens, people are not reacting from a place of comfort. They are reacting from a market that already feels expensive. That is also why refinery problems tend to feel bigger than their technical descriptions. A fire in a reformer unit may sound like a narrow industrial issue, but when households are already paying more each week to stay mobile, the market does not need to explain itself in engineering language. Families feel the result in simpler terms. If the system gets tighter, the pressure usually does not stay inside the system, and once fuel becomes more expensive, the impact reaches beyond the gas station. Commuting costs rise. Weekly flexibility shrinks. Other spending becomes tighter. Households become more cautious. That is how a refinery problem travels from plant equipment to family budgets. The link is not emotional, it is economic. This is also why the broader market data matters so much. If gasoline production had been rising strongly, if inventories were comfortable, and if retail prices were already low, a refinery incident might still matter, but the consequences would likely feel more contained. That is not the environment shown in the current reporting. The reporting shows a market with high retail prices, lower gasoline production, rising futures, and warnings about historically low inventories later in the season. So the right way to understand this story is not as a single dramatic event that explains everything by itself. It is as a new disruption landing in a market that was already vulnerable. That vulnerability is the real issue, because when the fuel market becomes more vulnerable, ordinary families are the ones who end up carrying the uncertainty. They are the ones paying weekly prices that reflect not only crude oil, but refining stress, supply tightness, and distribution pressure. And they are the ones who have to absorb those costs without the benefit of technical explanations or advance warning. That brings the story to its most important point. A refinery problem does not need to dominate the headlines for weeks to matter. It only needs to hit a market that is already tight enough for households to feel every extra dollar. In the final part, that is where the focus shifts fully to everyday life. How this kind of market stress spreads through commuting, budgeting, and middle-class financial stability, and what viewers should watch next if they want to understand whether the pressure at the pump is likely to ease or stay in place. What matters most in a story like this is not whether a refinery problem sounds dramatic. What matters is whether it changes the cost of ordinary life. And that is where the real impact becomes clear. For most households, fuel is not a one-time expense. It is a repeating obligation. It comes back every week, sometimes more than once. That is why even modest pressure in the fuel system can feel larger than it looks on paper. A small increase at the pump is not experienced once and forgotten. It is repeated through commutes, errands, school drop-offs, grocery runs, medical appointments, and all the other trips that make up normal life. That repetition is what turns a market problem into a household problem. When gasoline is already expensive, families do not need a major nationwide shortage to feel more pressure. They only need a market that remains tight enough to keep prices elevated or sensitive enough that any new disruption pushes costs higher. And once that happens, the burden does not stay neatly contained within the fuel budget. It spreads into the rest of the month. A household paying more for fuel has less flexibility everywhere else. That may not produce an immediate crisis. In many cases, it looks quieter than that. It means less room for discretionary spending, less room for convenience, less room for error. A family may still meet its obligations, but with more caution and less confidence, and that is often how economic pressure works in real life. It does not always arrive as collapse. More often it arrives as narrowing. That is especially true for middle-class households, which are often stable enough to keep functioning, but not insulated enough to ignore repeated increases in basic costs. These are families that still have to drive, still have to pay bills, and still have to make a budget work from one week to the next. What a refinery problem does to them is not always visible in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it adds another layer of strain to a budget that may already be carrying high housing costs, higher grocery bills, expensive insurance, and other recurring obligations. This is why fuel matters so much psychologically as well as financially. Gasoline is one of the few prices people encounter constantly and directly. It is public. It is easy to compare. It changes how people feel about their financial position very quickly. When that number stays high, or becomes more vulnerable to further pressure, households become more defensive. They plan more carefully. They spend more cautiously. They start treating ordinary movement through the week as something that has to be managed more tightly. That is not an overreaction. It is a rational response to repeated cost pressure. And it helps explain why the effects of refinery problems often feel larger than the technical details would suggest. The public may never need to know how a reformer works in engineering terms. What matters is that the unit involved at Chalmette was tied to high-octane gasoline components, that the broader market was already showing signs of strain, and that consumers were already paying high retail prices. In that setting, a refinery problem is not just another industry update. It becomes one more reason households may continue to feel squeezed. This is also where the larger pattern comes into view. Taken by itself, one refinery incident may sound isolated, but that is not how consumers experience the fuel market. They experience the fuel market through accumulation, higher national averages, lower gasoline production, rising futures, concerns about low inventories. Then a refinery problem lands on top of that. Each signal adds to the same conclusion. The system does not have much excess room, and families may be the ones absorbing the cost of that tightness. That is the broader vulnerability this story reveals. A refinery problem becomes financially important when it does not land in a comfortable market. It lands in a market where regular gasoline is around $4.53 a gallon, where premium is above $5, where diesel is even higher, and where prices are already far above where they were a year ago. In that kind of environment, even a limited disruption can matter because households are already paying from a position of strain. So what should viewers watch next? The first thing is gasoline production in upcoming EIA reports. If production remains weak, the market stays more exposed to additional pressure. The second is inventory levels. If inventories continue moving toward unusually low territory, that makes the system less able to absorb new disruptions. The third is the national average price at the pump. That is still the most visible sign of whether stress inside the system is reaching consumers. And finally, it is worth watching whether the gap between regular, mid-grade, and premium prices changes, because the Chalmette incident involved a unit tied to high-octane gasoline components. None of that guarantees a specific outcome, and it would be wrong to suggest otherwise. The public reporting does not support a precise claim about how many cents this one incident may add to prices, or exactly how long any effect might last. But it does support a much more important conclusion. When refining problems hit a market that is already tight, ordinary people do not need to understand every technical detail to feel the consequences. They feel them in the price of staying mobile. They feel them in the shrinking flexibility of the weekly budget, and they feel them in the growing sense that one more essential cost has become harder to control. That is what a refinery problem does to your wallet. It does not always arrive as a headline large enough to dominate the national conversation. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through a tighter market, a more expensive fill-up, and a household budget that has to absorb one more cost increase without gaining anything in return. That is how industrial strain becomes personal financial pressure, and that is why this story matters. Not because a refinery is the center of attention, and not because one company is the main character. It matters because fuel systems are part of everyday life, whether most people see them or not. When a key part of that system becomes less stable, the effects move outward. And for millions of households, the place where those effects become real is not inside the refinery. It is in the wallet.